Hey, shalom and welcome. My name is Courtney. I'm going to be your host today on Biblical Apologetics. Today we have an interview with a Bible scholar, and let me introduce him for you, and he will be able to kind of go over some of the stuff. His name is Aaron Higashi. Did I say that right?
Yes, very good.
Perfect. Yay. I'm all about maybe making sure I pronounce people's names right. Just out of respect. So, Aaron, how are you?
I'm well. I'm caffeinated, and I've already prayed. So what could possibly go wrong at this point?
Right. Same. I'll give you a little grace. Give me a little grace, and we'll get this thing going. Okay, so tell us a little bit about yourself. Now, guys, I have come to know of Aaron through TikTok. Look, guys, TikTok is where it's at if you want to get exposure to a lot of different things, right? I think TikTok is interesting. It's kind of like the world at your hand. It's different than the web. It's different than YouTube. You have 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 3 minutes, and the algorithms are exposing you to people that you otherwise wouldn't maybe interact with. And I like that because I like getting outside of echo chambers. And so I could totally kick it with Aaron and listen to a lot of his lectures. He's a cool dude. I discovered that whenever you did your video, what'd you say? I would only have to survive one kick. The thing with
Okay. Yeah.
It was wonderful. I liked it. So, okay. So introduce yourself. Tell us what your credentials are, what you do, things of that nature.
Well, my name is Aaron Higashi. I am an adjunct faculty member in the College of Theology at Grand Canyon University in Phoenix, Arizona. And I also teach in an adjunct capacity at Chicago Theological Seminary, which is where I did my PhD studies. I have a PhD in Bible, culture, and hermeneutics. My background is in philosophy and religious studies, and then I did biblical studies in a master's program and at the PhD level. And this is what I love to do. I found my way to TikTok sort of in the middle of the pandemic, primarily out of boredom, I think, and because I kept seeing things pop up I think I was on Instagram, and you would see people would copy over their TikToks from there. And I got sort of interested in what people were doing over there, and there didn't seem to be a lot of scholarship in general. It's a younger audience, so you don't necessarily expect that. But people were doing hot takes about Bible and religion and philosophy, and I figured maybe I could contribute in some way and make biblical scholarship a little bit more accessible to some of the young people in particular, and just people in general who otherwise wouldn't have access to it. And that's what got me interested in doing stuff on TikTok. And I've been doing stuff pretty regularly on there, about a video a day, for probably about a year now or so, I guess.
Yeah, no, I'm a big proponent of scholars, utilizing scholars, even scholars that don't look. I lean a little more conservative, and there's a lot of conservative scholars I don't agree with. So I think being able to get your feelers out there and experience a plethora of scholars, critical scholars, I think that is, at least I like doing that. I know a lot of people like to stay within their comfort zone, but I'm known for diving out there. So I want to pick your brain a little on some subjects. Some of your videos are intriguing. Now, I've given you a little pushback on some. We have kind of had some conversations back and forth, and I think it's very nice of you to entertain me. And I think it's very nice of you to explain it in a way that I think comes from your teaching, because I think you have that teacher's voice and that teacher's tone. It seems that you're able to explain things in a way that maybe some scholars make other people fall asleep. Excuse me. So let's talk about this one. Is the Bible self-critical? And I need a water drink, so go ahead and take that away.
I think so. I posted a video about the Bible's capacity for self-criticism in response to somebody who had made a comment saying that the Bible is very propagandistic. And I definitely agree that there are parts of the Bible that have an element of propaganda to them, for sure. But I don't think, if we're talking about biblical genres of biblical literature, if we're trying to get closer to the text and understand it on its own terms, I don't think it helps us very much to make generalizations and say like the entire Bible is propaganda, or huge chunks of the Bible is propaganda. And that's because propaganda tends not to be self-critical. And I think the Bible criticizes itself and many of its own theological ventures and theological institutions in a variety of ways. So from a narrative perspective, there's hardly any element of biblical theology that you won't also find some voice that's willing to criticize at some point. The monarchy in ancient Israel is a significant social, political, and theological institution, but there is critiques of the monarchy. In 1 Samuel chapter 8 is an extended critique of the monarchy. Cultic sacrifice is obviously a significant part of Pentateuchal law codes in general, and especially in the text of Leviticus. That it's a big part of ancient Israelite life. But there's critiques of cultic sacrifice in Isaiah 1 and Micah 6. And the list goes on. So in narratives, you'll often find characters who are willing to critique sort of other theological projects that are happening in the Bible. And if propaganda would do this, you would just be undermining whatever point you're trying to make. If you think of like some propaganda that for some war effort, right? Like a state is trying to put out and get people hyped up on going to war, but then they also produce a bunch of pacifist literature about how the evils of war and stuff like that just wouldn't work as propaganda. Right. And that's what we have in the Bible.
It'd be like the worst marketing scheme ever. Like, let's
buy this product or don't.
Or don't. Yeah, exactly. I like that. See, guys, in case you don't know, that's kind of the stuff you'll get from him from TikTok. A little bit of bringing it down to a level that's more appeasing, more visually appeasing. I know the Bible is not so visually appeasing for a lot of younger people. So I would just like to compliment you right quick and say that I think you do a good job of making it entertaining for people so that they are more willing to listen. So
thank you very much.
You're welcome. So let's get started into Genesis 1 and 2. And I also asked you, would you be willing to cover the book of Jubilees? Now, take your time, dive into this, really whatever you feel like you need to say here. Break it down however you feel like you need to. All of your opinions on all three of these, if you don't mind.
Well, on TikTok, I usually talk about Genesis 1 and 2 in the context of talking about two things: contradictions in the Bible more generally, and then also some of the basics of what's called source criticism. And source criticism is a method in biblical scholarship where you attempt to get at the documents that sort of lie behind the final composition of the text that we have today. So for a long time in sort of mainstream biblical scholarship, there have been 4 source texts recognized to be behind the first 5 books of the Bible. This is a big part of the documentary hypothesis,
which we are going to get into as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and so in an effort to try to, Genesis chapter 1 and 2 are generally recognized to be written by different authors and come from different sources. And since that's such a big part of biblical scholarship, it's an easy sort of launching off place to talk about a number of issues. And Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 contradict each other in a couple of places, and it's an easy conversation to have with people who might be opposed to the idea that the Bible has contradictions in it, or who might not be used to thinking of the Bible in terms of its underlying sources. So in just to summarize very quickly, in Genesis chapter 1, in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, the order in which things are created contradicts between the two chapters. So in Genesis chapter 1, you get vegetation created on the 3rd day, animals are created on the 5th and 6th day, and then human beings are created as sort of the crown of creation last at the very end of the 6th day. But in Genesis chapter 2, you have Adam, at least by himself, being created before there's any vegetation on the earth, before anything else really is made at all. And then all animals are created sort of simultaneously and for him. And then you only get Eve, a woman, created after that. So obviously these two orders cannot simultaneously both be true. It's either one or the other, or neither, I suppose, if we're going to think about like this in terms of what actually happens. And many people are just sort of surprised to see them laid out that way. We tend to read these texts sort of separately and not think about them together, or the kind of narrative claims that these two texts are making together. So I've had a number of conversations with people back and forth about the nature of these contradictions and what that might imply for, biblical authority or inspiration, or things like that. The standard scholarly explanation of why there are contradictions is because Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 are written by different people who composed these two very distinct stories for different audiences in different times and different places. And so we would expect them, using that framework to contradict.
Now, how do you feel about people that give you pushback and say, what if it's just different angles? What if it, how do you, like, what are some of the pushbacks that you typically get on that from, I guess more the conservative side that says, no, it's all one. It's written, yeah, maybe by different people, but like, what are some of the pushbacks that you feel that you need to address?
Well, there is one pushback is, I mean, people will hold up Mosaic authorship as sort of a result of long tradition. Many people think that the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, were written by Moses. And obviously the claim that they are written by 2 separate people is incompatible with the idea that it was written by Moses. So some people will try and assert Mosaic authorship, which I think just it doesn't explain the data as best as 2 different authors. One person tends not to write contradictory stories. Again, for that same sort of propaganda reason, you'd be undermining whatever point you were trying to make in the telling of one story with a contradictory story. There are more sophisticated things. People will try and harmonize the text in some ways. They'll say that they are to be read sequentially. So Genesis chapter 1 happens first, and then Genesis chapter 2 sort of happens second, and they don't really contradict. They're just talking about entirely different places.
Right.
I don't think that works so well because Genesis 2 is pretty clear that nothing is made yet. There are no men yet before Adam is made. There's nobody available to be Adam's helpmate before Eve is made. If we read these texts sequentially, then there's tons of people around from Genesis chapter 1 who would be available. Tons of animals too. It would be unnecessary to create new animals to see if those. It makes no sense to say that Adam is, it's not good for him to be alone, as we see in Genesis 2. He's not alone. There's tons of other people around from Genesis 1. So another thing that I've heard recently on TikTok and YouTube in particular is, well, there are 2 different creation stories, but they have different and complementary focuses. So the Genesis 2 sort of zooms in on, this is the language, zooms in on and is more specific about particular things. Genesis 1 is this very generic, sort of generalized creation story with a cosmic scope. And then Genesis 2 is this much more local, specific kind of story. And first of all, I don't think that characterization is true. I think Genesis 1 is very specific about some things, in general about others, and Genesis 2 is very specific about some things, in general about others. And secondly, that wouldn't fix the problem of contradictions between them, even if that were the case. Right? Even if I'm speaking very generally and then I speak very specifically later, but I contradict the generalities that I said, there's still a contradiction.
Okay.
So I think it might help us to fit them together in a theological way and sort of make meaning out of the texts. But I don't think it resolves the problem of the contradiction.
Gotcha. So how do you feel if someone brings in the book of Jubilees as kind of like the go-between between really explaining the lesser, right? The lesser Genesis, kind of explaining some things that may be missing within the Genesis narrative. What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, Jubilees is an interesting text. It's probably written in the 2nd century BCE. It's written at a time where several other texts like this are produced. They're almost like midrash, creative, interpretive additions to previous texts. Daniel is sort of like this, also written in the 2nd century, or at least finalized in the 2nd century BCE. It sort of elaborates on the period of the Babylonian exile. Enoch is like this, sort of elaborating on, in particular, the flood accounts and the story of these fallen angel figures. And Jubilees is sort of the same thing. Jubilees is an extended commentary on the book of Genesis. And you're right, it does sort of flesh out or add to several things that aren't there in the text of Exodus, or in the text of Genesis, rather. And in its first couple of chapters, it also attempts to sort of harmonize Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. By having Adam is created along with the general human beings, but then Eve is created on a different week secondarily, and Adam doesn't have this special creation. So it's sort of it also has the Garden of Eden being made on the 3rd day along with all the vegetation. So it sort of combines these 2 stories together in an attempt to harmonize them.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and you have other information that we then find utilized within the rest of the Tanakh, which is the woman being unclean after giving birth to a daughter versus a son being twice as long, and it explains some things as to why that is. For those of you who don't know, you've probably always wondered, well, a woman giving birth to a daughter is the same as a woman giving birth to a son. Why is she twice as long unclean? Things of that nature. And Jubilees kind of goes in and explains these things. And so I think it's a very interesting text. I think it's one that I think scholars take it a bit more serious than some other extra biblical books out there. What do you think? As a scholar yourself, what do you think?
Perhaps. I think from a Christian standpoint, I mean, many early Christian thinkers really loved the Book of Jubilees and relied on it a lot for thinking about some of these things that are happening in Genesis. Paul seems to have loved it a lot. The idea he expresses in Galatians about how the law was given by an angel is something that you get from Jubilees, because it's this angel of the presence who's sort of standing there at Mount Sinai, who's explaining these things to Moses. That's sort of the frame narrative that's placed around.
Yeah, and I think you see remnants of that in Isaiah 63. Is it Isaiah 63 where it discusses the Melach Penah? I think it is the way it's worded, which is the angel of the faces, or the angel of the presence, which we find in Exodus as well. And some have speculated, and I've speculated the same, that it's likely Gabriel, because Gabriel introduces himself to Mary as the angel that stands in the presence of the Lord. So how do you think there's kind of like trying to mesh these ideas together or expound on them?
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, like I was saying before, I think a lot of this literature written during this period takes these sort of these interesting gaps in other biblical books and then tries to flesh them out and make them relevant to their contemporary communities. Like you were saying with some of the purity concerns, perhaps it wasn't, the audience at the time wasn't sure, why are we doing this practice? And so the Jubilees sort of goes back and reinserts an explanation for these contemporary issues in the far past.
Okay.
So I think it's a way of updating biblical texts and bringing them into the present to make them address contemporary concerns.
Gotcha. Okay, so that's going to bring us to the next topic, which is going to be the letters in the documentary hypothesis. What does, for those of you who don't know, the letters that I'm mentioning here is JEPD. Please explain, for those who don't know, what that means, and how what you just mentioned with Genesis 1 and 2 is relevant to what you're about to talk about.
Yeah, so again, the documentary hypothesis is a model for thinking about the composition of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And the documentary hypothesis puts forward the idea that the Pentateuch was originally composed by 4 independent sources that were then later edited together to form the text that we have today. And those 4 sources, sort of by convention and happenstance, are referred to with the letters J, E, P, and D. So those are the 4 authors or 4 sources behind the Pentateuch that we have, according to the documentary hypothesis. So J stands for the Yahwist. It was named in German, and so it's a J. Stands for the Yahwist, who is usually dated to the 10th or 9th century BCE. He primarily uses the name Yahweh for God prior to it being revealed to Moses in Exodus 3. Has a very folksy style, a very anthropomorphic depiction of God. It has a bit of a southern bias towards the kingdom of Judah, characteristics like that. E is the Elohist, and uses the term Elohim to describe God, again, prior to the divine name being revealed to Moses in Exodus 3. It focuses a lot on prophecy and dreams, visions, interpretation. It has a northern bias in favor of northern Israel. It focuses on the theme of the fear of God. It features a lot of characters doing things in what would then be northern locations like Shechem and stuff like that. P is the priestly source. It's usually dated to the 6th century BC, in the middle of Babylonian exile. It has many priestly concerns, cultic concerns. It's very highly structured. It has a very transcendent view of God. It has a lot of calendars, genealogies, names, dates, locations. It's very precise.
The legal stuff, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the legal material, especially the legal material related to the tabernacle and the priesthood and sacrifice, is unique to P. And then D is the Deuteronomist, who composes the book of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy has it's a very strong emphasis on covenant, on the love of God, God's loving kindness, his chesed. It also very strongly emphasizes the centralization of worship in and around Jerusalem, as opposed to allowing sacrifices.
Everywhere.
Yeah. So they're all written in very different times in different places with different theologies, that were then edited together. And when it comes to Genesis chapters 1 and 2, usually scholars say that Genesis chapter 1 was written by the priestly source. So it has this transcendent view of God that speaks the universe into existence. It refrains from using the divine name. It calls God Elohim instead, this much more generic title.
Mm-hmm.
And then Genesis chapter 2 would be the Yahwist, who uses the name Yahweh for God, and who has this much more anthropomorphic style. God, fashions Adam out of the dust of the earth and then breathes into him. Same thing in Genesis chapter 3. God is walking through the garden in the cool breeze of the evening and doesn't necessarily know where Adam is, has to ask where he is and what happened, and is not necessarily an omniscient God. So yeah, I'm a big. I think the documentary hypothesis has had a long history. I mean, it was popularized really in the late 19th century by Julius Wellhausen, and it was for the longest time almost like the only game in town. But then in the 70s, in particular, it got some rather substantial criticisms, especially from Europe, but from America too. And then it sort of fell out of favor. But I think in the last 10 years, it's really seen a resurgence.
Yeah.
And there have been a number of scholars that have sort of taken it up again and have I think, turned it into a much more modest and also better argued version of the hypothesis than we've had in generations past.
Yeah, I when I hear you describe this, I personally see different. I see different focal points with, like you were describing, like you have the priesthood that's focused on, you have in Deuteronomy more covenant based is focused on. In my mind, I see just different focuses.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that's what makes the authors unique. I feel like we forget people are still people and people still have personalities and they still have focal points and niches, right? You're definitely going to have like a priest. He's going to care mostly about laws and things like purity wise. And that may, if he's writing something, he's going to care and he's going to focus a lot on that. Whereas someone that's more of a layman is probably not going to focus so much on that, right? And they may
Right.
just get the overall idea. So do you think that's kind of what's going on here? Like a general focus on specifics, or do you think it's just you just four authors and that is what it is and it was just knitted together? And is there any order is what I'm saying?
Well, I definitely agree. I mean, they are four distinct authors. They definitely have different focuses. In large part, I think that's because they're writing for different purposes
Mm-hmm.
and for different audiences. So that shapes your focus quite a bit. The priestly author is writing for a priestly audience primarily, and so their concerns with priestly matters is to sort of memorialize their concept of the cult and how it's supposed to work, and probably in somewhat idealized terms. Whereas Jay is probably a lay author, and they're writing for sort of a court or scribal audience, just as a way of transmitting sort of important historical traditions.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they have very different purposes in writing, in addition to just having like different theological beliefs. They have different. So yeah, focal points is one way to say it. I think.
Gotcha. All right. So that's going to bring us into what do we do then? How do we read the Bible with various contexts? I remember you did a video where it was one of the funny ones. I really liked it.
There's only like two funny ones, so it's.
Yeah, no, but yes, but in those you really bring forward a lot of information and your personality shows, whereas it makes it memorable. So as you can see, but what's the difference now? I know there's a lot to cover here. What's the difference in context, in the historical context, as you said, social context? linguistic, narrative, literary, rhetorical, and formal. If you want to expound on this very briefly, you can give like 10-second answers and just kind of give the people a rundown, because I talk a lot about context, right?
Mhm.
But are we talking about narrative context? Are we talking about a historical context? And can narrative, right, lay everything out, but also have historical inside that? And does that historical and narrative context sometimes butt heads with maybe a prophetic context? And how do you view those? So I do a lot in this area. So this was a very fun one for me to watch. And then you laid all of it out. So go ahead, take it away. Tell us what you think.
But I think, like, at bottom, again, what I'm trying to do is just introduce people to things that are pretty commonly recognized in academic biblical scholarship.
Mhm.
So something that you'll often find people do online is when they want to challenge somebody else's interpretation of a text, they'll say, "You've taken that out of context,"
All right.
without any additional follow-up, as though that's the only thing they've taken it out of the context, and now it's bad, right?
Yeah.
Whereas they are putting it in context, whatever that means, and theirs is good. And so, I mean, this sort of misunderstands the entire conversation. Uh, any given verse in the Bible is at the center of dozens of multiple overlapping contexts.
Agreed.
And so you're never taking something out of the context, but rather you are negotiating with the contexts that that a particular text finds itself in, and you are making an interpretive choice to privilege some of these contexts over others when you are sort of crafting your interpretation.
So
You're going to
your
say,
hermeneutical approach really matters here.
yes, yeah, exactly. You are saying my interpretation is going to make most use of these contexts and then largely ignore, or at least sort of marginalize, other contexts.
Okay.
And everybody is doing this all the
Right.
time. And so so there's a sense in which everybody is taking the Bible text out of at least some context in order to do their interpretations. It would be impossible to interpret with every relevant context, having an effect on your interpretation simultaneously. That's just not possible. It would be too much information to sort through. So I mean, the video that I made was sort of just a funny one because I didn't like what was going on there, but I wanted to make people aware there are so many
Yeah.
different contexts, and we're not really, when we think about context, we often just think about sort of the immediate narrative context, like what's happening in the
Yeah.
story, and that's important for sure.
Right.
But there's also a historical context, like what were the circumstances that gave rise to the composition of this text? That's relevant. There's a social context behind that. How do elements of like gender or class or socioeconomic status,
Yes.
affect the evaluation of the text? There's always a linguistic context, the particular words that people are using. Those have their own history, right? Which
Mhm.
an author may be
Right.
deliberately using as a trope or playing against the type, right? I'm going to use this familiar word in a new way, right?
Yeah.
There's a literary context, so genre, right, is an
Mhm.
important element. A rhetorical context, this author is trying to persuade their audience of something, right?
Right.
There's elements of structure, like how is this passage situated in and amongst other passages? How is it situated in the book? How is
Mhm.
that book situated in the Bible?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's all these contexts could be relevant for an interpretation. And what we do as interpreter, what everybody does as an interpreter, is say, I'm going to focus on these and then largely ignore these others in order to make my interpretation of this passage.
Yeah, so I'm actually writing a book, an apologetic book, where I'm diving into a lot of context. And I tell you, I believe the Bible is a little bit more, I'll call it hyperlinked than maybe you would think it's kind of hyperlinked. So I'm finding you know the thing you see on Facebook where, what is that? It's the show where the guy, he's like smoking a cigarette. He looks, and he's pointing to the board, and he's got strings from here to there and there and there and there
Oh
and there.
yeah, I know the meme you're talking about.
Yes,
Yeah,
and he's like, and this is why this is true.
yeah.
Okay, so that's me trying to show all of the context. Like I'm trying to do it a good service here and show and be as honest as possible with the text, show the historical context, the social linguistics, all that. But you do, like you said, there's so much information. It's almost impossible to really expound on all of that and not be too far away from your original question, right? That you're trying to answer, that you're trying to get down to the hermeneutic, whatever that hermeneutical approach may be. And so I'm writing a book on this, and I find myself constantly saying something to the effect of referencing back to another passage that seems to be explaining the same. Yeah, it's quite exhausting. I won't lie. So I agree that whenever sometimes we look at passages, I think if we're trying to be honest, we have conversations, but if we do it by ourselves, we're looking at passages, we may just ignore, like you said, or marginalize some context in order to opt for what we are personally studying in the moment in ourselves. I think it becomes a little less marginalized when we midrash or we get with other people, because it kind of forces us to look outside of what we're seeing. And you say, well, have you considered the historical context of it? Oh, maybe not. Let's look, So do you think that tends to work a little better when you have kind of something that's peer reviewed and you can kind of get with other people? Do you think that it becomes a little less marginalized at that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think what it really does is it makes us more aware of the interpretive choices that we've made, right? So it's very easy to make these interpretive choices on an unconscious level. Like I don't even realize that I have chosen to set aside these contexts, right? I'm just reading the text in the way that I've sort of been trained to read it, or in the way that I've habituated into reading it, and I'm not even aware that this is happening. And then somebody else comes along and they're like, well, have you considered this? Or why are you not considering this? And then that gives you an opportunity to sort of take a step back and say, oh, I didn't even think about that. Or perhaps even I did think about that, but I chose not to include that as part of my interpretation. Right. So yeah, I mean, I think the Bible is best read in community, where you have other people around you who can call attention to this. And again, I think it's getting back to that idea, is making us aware of ourselves as an active interpreter who makes choices in order to produce these interpretations of the text.
Absolutely. Lovely answer. I think it was very well thought out, and it gives a lot of people a lot to think about. So you made a statement, and that's going to take us into our next question here. You made a statement that when you went into biblical studies, you kind of were less religious and you came out a little more religious. But do you find that people, especially when they go into graduate level biblical studies, that it makes them less religious? Or what's your experience here? As someone who lectures and teaches on the college level, what do you feel like you see? And what are some things that are concerning in this realm for you that you maybe want to express to the young people or marginalized group of people, or anything to that degree?
Yeah, I mean, going into like graduate level biblical studies is almost always a transformational experience. I don't think anybody comes out the other side of that with exactly the same beliefs that they went into it, one way or the other. And that's because it just confronts you with a huge amount of information, and you are forced to think through these texts in ways that you never have before. So it'd be very hard to just, sort of shrug your shoulders at all that stuff and just, come out completely the same on the other side. I think more people have popularized their stories about how they were religious and then they went into biblical studies, or they went to seminary, or they went to a Bible college or whatever, and then that reading the Bible for the first time really that killed their faith. And that's a pretty common story that you hear. And I was just sharing that it was sort of the opposite for me. I went into I didn't have this term at the time because I'm old and it was a long time ago, but I sort of deconstructed at the end of my undergraduate studies, and then sort of reconstructed, I guess, over the course of my my graduate studies. And so for me, academic biblical studies is a big part of the reason why I am a Christian today, and why I'm religious at all. And so I was sort of just sharing that experience in TikTok as maybe to balance out a little bit. I think the more common story about people who, I finally sat down and read the Bible, and that's what made me an atheist or agnostic or whatever. I think it's not an uncommon experience for people who believe in God because they have particular beliefs about the Bible to then go into graduate biblical studies and then lose their faith in God because graduate level biblical studies tore apart the beliefs they had about the Bible
Right.
They were the foundation for their belief in God.
Yeah.
So if you think the Bible is like very obviously inspired, or contains nothing morally problematic, or it's clear and easy to interpret, or it's free of errors and contradictions, or it's wholly distinct from other ancient Near Eastern literature, or you have this very fairy tale characterization of it being like a love letter from God, and then you actually get into the text and you see that it's none of those things.
Yeah.
And if those
Yeah.
were the reasons that you believed in God, then obviously you're going to stop believing in God, because
Yeah.
the graduate level biblical studies is going to take that away. But I think that for me, that was more just scouring away bad beliefs than it was getting rid of
You,
belief in God.
you, you seem to have approached it more rationally, like, okay, maybe I came into this not knowing what I was talking about. And so now I know, and I seem to be more educated now. And so now it gives me a solid foundation to have that faith in God on. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, there's several things. I mean, there are things happening in my personal life as well. I think for me, I mean, my undergraduate degree was in philosophy.
Oh,
And so I had a background in thinking philosophically about the idea of God. And
okay.
I think that gave me a reason to believe in God independent of anything that was happening in the Bible. Like whether the Bible exists at all, or tells any stories at all, or is good or bad, regardless of its content, I had resources to have
Mhm.
a belief in God regardless. So that sort of helped. And I think also for me, biblical studies was just enormously empowering. Like I got to become an active interpreter. I got to learn how to challenge other people's interpretations of the text that
Nice.
perhaps I didn't care for.
Yeah.
I became aware of how many different kinds of theology there are, which is another thing that I think sort of the average layperson is not aware of.
Yeah.
They will walk away from a church because it's too misogynistic. Well, let
Mhm.
me share with you feminist theology, right? They will walk away from a church because it's too comfortable with white nationalism. Well, let me show you Black liberation theology. They will
Mhm.
walk away from a church because they think it's too homophobic. Well, let me show you queer theology. They will walk away from a church because it's too militaristic, or something like, well, let me show you post-colonial theology, or there is a kind of theology and a kind of biblical interpretation behind that theology that addresses so many people's concerns
Mhm.
that if I think they just knew it existed, um,
Right.
it would help their the substance of their spiritual of their religious beliefs a lot more. And
Yeah.
that's what I try and do.
Yeah, I think a lot of people also negate the fact that your personal life really affects the way that you come at the Bible. I really think
Mm-hmm.
people negate that. I try to be as intellectual as possible, but to claim that anyone is removed from their own personal bias when
Mm-hmm.
interpreting things or looking at things, and I do my best to quote, let the text explain itself. And now we can get into what that means, or when I discuss this with people who say, well, you have a hermeneutical approach, and your hermeneutical approach is based on your experiences and the data that you've learned over the years and all of that. But really, I think people just negate the fact that marginalized groups feel marginalized within the Bible, or they feel like they're left out of the Bible, or they feel like there's nothing in the Bible for them, or and then they start to paint this picture of the Bible as something that it may have not have been, or maybe that people haven't thought of it differently in time. Like you said, well, let me show you that there are people that maybe don't interpret it the same exact way. Now, I think everybody needs to acknowledge that we all have bias in some way, shape, or form. This again takes me back to what I said in the last segment here. I said we should come together and learn from each other, because that's the only way we're going to be able to get out of our echo chambers, so to speak. So,
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, church and also, I mean, synagogue too is these tend to be fairly segregated places, ideologically
yes,
and racially, and segregated places. So finding a diverse group of people to read the text with can sometimes be a
yeah,
challenge.
yeah,
But yeah, it would be wonderful if we more regularly made an effort to do that, to read the Bible alongside other people who've had very different lives from our own, for
mhm.
exactly that reason.
Yeah. I catch a little flack sometimes for being willing to interview people that don't agree with me, like just flat out don't agree with me. And I can still break bread with them, still sit down, still talk to them, because I find value in people and what they, again, it takes me back to my original statements of, I realize very, maybe about, I've been Torah observant. I'm a Torah observant Christian. I don't know if you know that, but I'm a Torah observant Christian. And I've been Torah observant for over 10 years now. And, coming to this realization, it kind of hit me like I need to be a little more humble, and I need to realize I'm not the only one that's trying to understand the Bible. And so it kind of helps me open up and get outside of my echo chambers. And so I catch flack for that because, why aren't you interviewing, people? And it could be anyone. It could be a Jew. It could be a Christian. It could be a Muslim. As long as they agree with me. And I don't do that. I like to interview people that have more knowledge or more expertise in different areas. So I think more people should be willing to do that while being able to admit that there's some things that maybe they didn't know or that they can learn from other people. So, okay. So I did just mention that I am a Torah observant Christian. Now, you made a recent video, which I loved. And, most people would say, why would you like a video like that? But basically, you go into talking about, is there some sort of theological justification for Christians, at least in the early on, and as we segue into the time that we're in now, not keeping or following the law? And, you kind of expound a little bit on that. So would you like to do that here so that everybody can kind of pick your brain and wonder, why don't Christians want to follow the law, or, do they have theological justification for not doing that?
Yeah, a couple of videos have come up about this recently. I think one point is, let me start with the question: Do Christians in general have a good theological justification for not following the Torah? No, I don't think they do. Do they need a super good theological justification for not following the Torah? I don't think so. I think the bar for that is probably pretty low, and that's because Torah observance is not a significant part of like most forms of ancient Judaism from which Christianity descends. Right. And so one video I did was on how, the Torah, in the sense of identifying the first 5 books of the Bible, in that sense, and the law codes therein, was not written for most of ancient Israel's history. And as a result, there's no, for most ancient Israelites, there's no Torah to be Torah observant to for a long period of time. Ancient Israelite religion is not defined by Torah observance. It's defined by worship of Yahweh, but not Torah observance until, I don't think we get any early indications of this until the 5th century BCE. And then not really until like the 2nd century BCE, during, after the Maccabean revolt and the development of Pharisaic Judaism, and then moving into rabbinical Judaism. And then it's there that it sort of becomes, definitive. Like the Torah observance is the thing. That's what makes us who we are. That's a big part of it.
Right.
And so it's really there that it becomes this thing. So that Christians, when they're like, no, that's not really for us, they are in alignment with many other sort of strands of vaguely Jewish religion. Yeah. And even amongst Jews today, depending on the denomination of Jew, there are different ideas about what Torah observance ought to look like. Mm-hmm. It's entirely possible that you have a fairly liberal Reformed Jew who is as Torah observant as as your just generic evangelical Christian, in the sense that probably both are doing hardly anything that's that's Torah observant, at least by the lights of like Torah observant Christians or like an Orthodox Jew or something like that. They're probably both doing next to nothing. So I don't think most Christians probably have a very fragile theological justification for not doing it. I don't know how much of a justification they need, really, to not do it. So in the other video I made, I talked about, like in Acts 15, for example, the primary concern seems to be pragmatic. It's not so much there's a fancy theological justification for it, but rather just it would be an onerous burden to place on Gentile converts to ask them to do this stuff. So we're not going to ask them to do this stuff. And that's not really like, from the foundation of the world, we found this reason. It's not like that. It would be hard. So let's Let's not do
Yeah.
that. We have this very small religion. We want this to succeed. Let's set the bar sort of as low as possible and proceed from there. And I think that's really what it is at the end of the day. And then theological justifications are sort of given post hoc,
Yeah.
to sort of buttress it.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting when you bring up Acts 15. A lot of Torah observant people will tell you that's kind of like your starter pack, like just the bare bit. And if you know much about Judaism, you know that these are the things for sure, the 4 things that you've got to get rid of to even interact with Jews within the synagogue. Like you can't be drinking blood, come in with blood on your face and be like, yo, let's worship God together. And so that's kind of the theological stance for a lot in the Torah observant community, because then you continue to read, it talks about because Moses is preached in the synagogues every Shabbat. Well, if the 4 is there, why would a Christian be going to synagogue on Shabbat, right? If there's just the 4. And then you have the Christians that say, no, we're supposed to keep the big 10. So the big 10 or the 4, which one? The big 14, what are we looking at here? And so I think, like you said, it's definitely post hoc. Because I don't think there's a whole lot of justification within the text itself. However, we do, I rightly acknowledge that not all of Israel would have kept Torah, right? We find, when kings would acknowledge and they would find what we believe to be Deuteronomy and go, look at all this stuff that we've not been doing. Like we got to start doing this now. So yeah, I agree. Like it's not something that you've seen was common. Full quote Torah observance, which no one's ever fully Torah observant. So, Aaron, I really appreciate all of your comments and your thoughts and everything that you have to share. I think more people need to be exposed, like I said, to more ideas outside of what they're used to. So I think that you bring forward a lot of good points, and I think you do so from a very good lecture standpoint so that people can really absorb it and look into it. So do you have any, any links or lectures or TikTok? What are your socials? Let my people know, from those who may be blind but can hear, please tell them. And then I will also get that in and put it in the description box for those who can click on it and go and watch it. So.
The only social media that I have right now, like public social media, is on TikTok, and it's at ABH Bible. That's just my initials. So at ABH Bible is where I do all of my TikTok stuff. I try and post a video daily about how to read the Bible better and bring biblical scholarship and diverse methods of biblical interpretation and make them easy to digest for a lay audience. So.
Gotcha. Would you like to explain, because I don't know if we ever got to it, what is a quote scholar? For those who may not know, what is the difference between being scholarly minded and an actual scholar, a biblical scholar? Do you want to explain that?
I mean, there's a sense in which being a scholar is just somebody who pays their bills with scholarship. So there's a practical, like if you are writing books and if you are teaching at a university and if that's the way that you put food on the table, then in a certain sense you're a scholar, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's like a writer, even if a writer is writing, like dime store romance novels that aren't like, super enriching or literary or anything, but they're paying the bills with their writing, then you're a writer, right?
Yeah.
If you're paying the bills with music, you are a musician. So there's a sense in which a scholar is just somebody who pays the bills with scholarship, teaching and writing. I think in another sense, to be a scholar is to be a person who is trying to make contributions, to trying to advance our collective knowledge of something in a particular field, and they interact with other scholars of the same of the same desire, and they often peer review each other in various ways, keep each other accountable, argue against each other, preserve a collective body of knowledge, and they're trying to advance some area of discourse. So to be a biblical scholar, and I'm a young, very tiny, just starting off biblical scholar, the goal there is to advance our knowledge of the Bible, so that future generations know it just a little bit better than we did.
Yeah, we definitely want to leave behind a legacy. I have a friend that always says, leave the world a little better than the way that we found it. And so
Yes.
I think it's a beautiful idea, and I wish more people would strive for it. So Aaron, I appreciate your time here. Thank you so much. And again, everyone, all of his stuff will be in the description box below. So make sure to check out his stuff. Thank you. Shalom Aleichem.